in your textbooks, taboo recreation. I had a lot of fun putting together this lecture content, so again, I hope you enjoy listening to me. Hopefully you're somewhere warm and cozy, and you're able to kind of really enjoy and dig into this chapter here and its content. So a couple major takeaways that I'm hoping for you to come away from with this chapter, with this particular lecture. Firstly, I'm hoping that we can all, by the end of this, be able to define taboo and deviance and explain how these concepts arise in leisure spaces. I'm hoping we can all identify examples of taboo recreation and evaluate both the positive and negative effects that result from these pastimes. And lastly, I'm hoping that we can describe 4 popular theories of deviance using real-world examples. More specifically today, we'll be going over deviance in leisure, giving you some building block concepts, taking kind of a big picture view of what's going on in this particular topic. Then we'll be diving into some specific examples of taboo recreation, and then finally some explanations of deviance. So for things first, deviance in leisure. 2 major building block concepts for today are as follows. Firstly is taboo. This is a social group's ban, prohibition, or avoidance of something based on the group's sense that it is excessively repulsive, offensive, or sacred. I like to think of a taboo as sometimes an overt, so something that we all know and talk about and can kind of like formulate in our brains, rule. Sometimes though, taboos are covert, so maybe it's not something that's overly obvious to a society, it's not something that we talk about, but something that is somewhat universally agreed upon within a particular culture, that is a rule that we do not do, we do not touch, we do not talk about, whatever that might be. A taboo is almost like a rule, whether written or unwritten. Deviance, on this opposite side of the same coin, is the behaviors or actions that depart from established social, cultural, or legal norms. So while taboo is the rule, deviance is someone breaking that rule. But taking from your textbook directly, a quote from page 176, in truth, even though we do have these understandings as a society of what is right, what is wrong, what are these things that we should not be, what are the lines that we should not be overstepping, in truth, everyone is involved in at least occasionally deviant behavior. So I'm hoping that you can give some thought to that all today. A couple more pieces of the puzzle here. Such prohibitions are present in virtually all societies. Taboos may be prohibited explicitly, like I said, for example, and more specifically within a legal system or religion, or implicitly, for example, by social norms or conventions followed by everyone in a particular culture or organization. So, for that first point, taboo and deviance is deeply related to social norms and individual perspectives. And what a society considers to be taboo or deviant changes over time. Taboos are often meant to protect the individual, but there are other reasons for their development. There might be an ecological or medical background for many taboos, including some that are seen as religious or spiritual in origin. Common taboos involve restrictions or ritual regulation of killing and hunting, sex and sexual relationships, reproduction. A lot of taboos stem around to the dead and their graves, as well as religion. And something that I know some of you in class are interested in is food and dining. I know a lot of you stated in that quick little class poll a couple weeks ago that you're very interested in dining out. And we can kind of think of a couple things, perhaps if we have certain restrictions on ourselves, maybe for vegans, it's quite taboo to think about killing and consuming animals. And you'll see here the book that I have on screen as well too, very taboo in almost all societies, is eating fellow humans. So a book that I have there on screen, very, very interesting, pretty easy read too, titled there Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. But I think something that to really think about and really kind of represent this idea of taboo. It's this kind of dark topic that we feel icky and like sometimes we feel like a little bit nauseous when we think about, like, there tends to be quite a visceral reaction to this, again, kind of dark corner in our brains, that really represents that idea of my culture, my society says that this is wrong. This is a no-go zone. Don't even consider it. I have a QR code to follow up that book there. Again, hopefully I'm not at all in any means condoning cannibalism. I hope no one misrepresents my statements here as such. But I think a really kind of, again, visceral topic to kind of unlock the larger conversation that we're going to be having today about taboo. Back to that QR code on the screen. I was just listening to this week, this is a fairly recent episode, to a podcast that I really enjoy called Search Engine, where various people come to the podcast, ask the podcaster a question, and then he goes off and does extensive research on the question and comes back with really interesting answers. This past week was a 4-year-old named Otto, and he came to the podcast with a question with the help of his mom, who a couple weeks ago they were talking about what they should eat for dinner, and Otto suggested, I would like to eat a human head, and he's really adorable, and I highly suggest listening to this podcast just for Otto alone. And so Otto, having made this statement and then like having this come out of his mouth and just kind of realizing like, whoa, my parents are like really not into this idea of eating a human brain. Like, this is really interesting. And again, with Otto's parents, mom and dad, trying to explain, okay, why don't we eat humans? I think there's a really interesting conversation at the start of this podcast in the first 14 minutes about this idea of taboo. And they even go so far to kind of ask this thought-provoking question, especially with the popularity now of various lab-grown, or I guess lab-produced non-meat meats, so like your Impossible burgers. Now there's also been further developments of lab-grown meats where they're taking DNA and other organic materials from animals, not harming any of those animals, but reproducing meat from those animals within a lab for human consumption. They asked a question at the start of the podcast. What would you do if, making sure no one was ever hurt, no human was injured, whether that's physically or psychologically, would you eat lab-grown human meat? And I think, again, even me just asking that question, I kind of get that icky feeling in my chest too. So something to think about, kind of broaching this idea of taboo. And please, if you have an hour, I think the podcast is, I highly suggest that you listen to it so it can kind of give you a little bit of a broader context for the story that I was telling about Otto there. So with that, perhaps cannibalism is included in this list, but maybe an opportunity to ask yourself and to pause on this video here. I'll pause for 5 seconds, but please do physically pause the video while you think. What are your personal taboos, and what caused you to hold these taboos? Was it certain people, certain institutions, certain beliefs? I guess more specifically, in addition to me asking to write down, again, what might be an explicit or implicit list of taboos that we hold, give some thought to who decides what is deviant. Is it the government? Is it Canadian society in general? Religious institutions that you're a part of? Is it marketers and businesses? Is it your friends, your parents, your professors, etc.? Take a minute here. What are your personal taboos? And what has caused you to hold these beliefs? Please pause me here, but I will move forward. So, while the textbook tends to focus on the negative consequences of taboo and deviant leisure, quote unquote, the focus of this chapter will be the adverse outcomes of engaging in pastimes that society considered deviant. I do like to always, when there's evidence suggesting that there are pros and cons to something, that there is another point that is valid to be argued, I do like to present both for your consideration. There are certain cases where taboo and deviant leisure can be harmless and even positive for individuals, and when those cases do exist, I will be highlighting them in this lecture. So kind of formalizing and kind of crystallizing these broad ideas of taboo and deviance that was mentioned at the start of today's video. There are four types. Typology is just a fancy way of saying type of deviance. Those are formal deviance, informal deviance, playful deviance, and pro-leisure. With formal deviance, these are behaviors that violate normal cultural norms, like laws. Formal deviance refers to behaviors that directly contravene established laws and regulations within a society. And these behaviors tend to be explicitly outlined and enforced by governing bodies. An example that I have for formal deviance would be doping in sports, such as the use of banned performance-enhancing substances by athletes, or even intentional fouls in games that breach the rules and regulations that are set by the wider sports associations and upheld by referees or anti-doping committees. With informal deviance, these are behaviors that violate informal cultural norms, like customs. These involve actions that transgress unwritten social norms, and these norms are not legally enforced, but do carry significant cultural weight. An example of this might be excessive celebrations in sport, especially, when you're in a time sport. I was going to say especially gentlemanly sport, but I think this is kind of like an agreed upon norm in all sports, is even if it's a very rough and tumble sport, aggressive, competitive, let's say like football and soccer, it's pretty frowned upon for your opponent if they take, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 10 seconds for a celebration is fine. And, we lost the point, we're angry anyways. But as soon as we start kind of reaching that threshold of like, okay, now you're getting to the point where you're rubbing this into my face, this kind of becomes that, creates that sensational or that type of informal deviance. Next is playful deviance. These are improper yet entertaining behaviors in certain settings. So these refers to behaviors that may deviate from social norms, but are tolerated or even celebrated in specific contexts due to their entertaining or playful nature. One example that I hear is Mardi Gras celebrations, where participants engage in very eccentric and exuberant physical activities or costumes that might be considered improper or unconventional in a day-to-day work setting, let's say, but are accepted in celebrating during the event. And lastly, pro-leisure. These are the pastimes of the lowest social economic classes. And these activities might reflect a different cultural and social context compared to those typically embraced by higher social strata. An example that I'll be going through in far more detail on the next slide here is roller derby, which historically emerged from working class communities, which can be considered an example of pro-leisure. It's a high-contact, aggressive sport traditionally associated with grassroots, non-mainstream participation that contrasts with more conventional and elite sports. A little bit more about this idea of roller derby. I'm seeing if this video is wanting to play on my end. No, I think it's happy. So a little bit, I'll get you to click through that video on your own time. I'm not going to watch it here with you, so please pause me after I ramble here just a little bit about roller derby to watch this video. A little bit about the history of roller derby. A gentleman named Leo Seltzer created what we know today as roller derby. Seltzer realized that sports demographics were missing female participation and interest, and in 1935, Seltzer introduced his version of marathon skating, or roller derby, to the public in Chicago. Roller derby is often seen as a feminist sport, pushing against various stereotypes of womanhood and traditional femininity. Women who skated back in the first half of the 21st century were often criticized for changing and ignoring traditional feminine roles, such as being a homemaker, mother, or wife. And additionally, they engaged in violence, which is part of the sport, as well as actively participating in sport itself. Both of those things seen as being very immoral for women. Today's roller derby continues to pull away from traditional womanhood and femininity by using a DIY punk aesthetic and often third-wave feminism had an influence on the independence and aggressiveness of these all-women leagues, and quickly became a home for the LGBTQ plus community to find a safe and welcoming space. Since most leagues and teams were formed by stay-at-home mothers, lawyers, teachers, physicians, as well as younger college students and misfits, roller derby quickly became an avenue for expression for women everywhere. And a little bit of kind of Edmonton-based interest. Eville is the name of our local roller derby and was formed in 2006 by a group of pioneering women intent on promoting an active lifestyle and encouraging alternative sporting options for women in Edmonton and surrounding communities. That's EVILLE, and they do have a website that you can click around on if this is something that interests you. But I'm going to stop talking here for 5 seconds before I move on. Please click the link at the bottom of this slide here so you can watch the video about meeting the kick-ass women of the Texas Banked Track Roller Derby. Hopefully you enjoyed that video, and again, kind of crystallizing these concepts even further. So in addition to the 4 typologies of deviance, there's also 3 dimensions of deviant leisure, which have been identified by Williams and Walker in 2006. And these are tolerability, criminality, and intensity. So again, I'm hoping to make very, very clear that deviance is not black and white, that there is a spectrum, there is gray area, there's a whole rainbow of deviance kind of expressed in the wider literature. So the first dimension is tolerability, and kind of on that spectrum there, from one end tolerable to intolerable. Tolerable deviance means that the welfare of the community is still believed to be preserved, while intolerable deviance is often accompanied by considerable agreement about its wrongfulness, a harsh community reaction, and a judgment that it is especially harmful. So tolerable, very much, this entire facet is very much focused on what the community thinks. So tolerable, the community says, yes, we're fine, no one's getting hurt. Intolerable, the community's unhappy, there's a lot of judgment, the community agrees that this is wrong, this is a bad form of leisure to be engaging in. Next is criminality, which is a little bit more straightforward. And this is kind of, again, on that spectrum with legitimate, so you're not breaking any laws. In the middle, non-criminal, so you might not be breaking a law, but again, we kind of widely agree that you are teetering on the edge. And then criminal, you could be arrested and put in jail. And lastly, intensity. This is going to be a term that you've heard before, so this depends on how casual versus serious a leisure activity is. So, as we know, as we've spoken about, casual leisure can be defined as immediately intrinsically rewarding, but is a relatively short-lived pleasurable activity requiring very little or no special training to enjoy it. In contrast, serious leisure involves the need to persevere, career-like qualities, requires significant effort, whether that's acquiring knowledge, training, or skill, providing durable benefits or rewards, having a distinctive identity in the activity as well as the activity providing an individual with unique ethos. So again, the dimensions of deviant leisure lie on that spectrum as well too, with how intense, how much time and effort and resources it takes to engage in this deviant form of leisure. I'll be even more specific here on the next slide. A few examples that I have here that are outlined, and I believe there's one example so that every kind of dimension is covered. So with tolerable form, so again, what the community thinks or tends to think of a specific leisure or pastime. So in the tolerable side of things, we have erotic literature, we have religious cults. Again, tolerable in that the community doesn't feel like they're hurting anyone directly. Intolerable on the other side, we have motorcycle gangs, and at the very bottom there, which is very interesting, and I won't go into whether killing people is considered a pastime or not, which has actually been covered quite a bit in the literature, and it's quite an interesting read, those journal articles. We have intolerable serial murder. In terms of criminality, so we have legitimate, so again, same in that erotic literature. Even further down, legitimate, we have religious cults. For non-criminal, we have social nudism, so certain spaces or places, you're allowed to be naked, but again, depending on the place or the context that you're in, you are definitely teetering that line. There are places where you are not allowed to be nude. And then we also have motorcycle gangs further down. And then criminal, we have, depending on the place, again, this was in 2006, we have marijuana use or drug use. We have street racing, and we have shoplifting and vandalism. And then lastly, intensity. Casual is reading erotic literature at the very top there. And more serious, the one that involves a little bit more time and perhaps resources, we have religious cults, we have computer hacking, and we have being a Trekkie, which is very interesting as well too. So again, hopefully this table here, which is pulled directly from Williams and Walker, kind of helps solidify and again crystallize what these three dimensions of deviant leisure actually look like. What are some examples of what these activities might look like based on those three different dimensions? So one more question for you all, an opportunity for individual reflection, and this will be my last one for today, but again, just because I think this idea of taboo is so dependent on the individual, even though these taboos are very much formed on larger culture, you have a part to play in that culture as well too. So my question for you is can leisure only be considered leisure when it is healthy, moral, optimistically productive, and legal? Or, in your opinion, can leisure be an honest, personal expression regardless of societal norms? I'm curious what you think of that. Does leisure always have to be something that is good and is good for all? Or can it be something that exists regardless of societal norms, that can be an act of deviance? So I'm hoping that you can take a moment here. Again, I'll pause for 5 seconds, but then I will move on, so please do physically pause me, where you do pick a side, and I do suggest writing this down, and try to justify your position with a reference to what we have learned so far in class. So please pick a side, again, whatever feels most right to you. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle, but justify that opinion with what we have been learning so far in RLS 100. Maybe you pull some previous examples of history where, let's say, in ancient Greece, they very much believed that in order to be considered leisure, what you were doing had to be good and beneficial to society and making you the best version of yourself. Or maybe you talk about the Romans and them kind of engaging in, more rowdy forms of leisure that, again, were maybe more of that honest personal expression that wasn't necessarily moral at all times. So give some thought to that question, justify your answer, and I do highly suggest that you write down your thoughts and do kind of linger on this question here. You might see it again. All right, so moving forward to kind of topic number 2 on our roadmap for today, examples of taboo recreation. And kind of an umbrella for the examples that I've kind of picked out with the help of the textbook, and that I'll dive into more detail here, is this idea of purple recreation. Purple recreation categorizes dark, unusual, taboo, deviant, or socially unacceptable forms of recreation and leisure activities, and is a topic or concept put forth by Curtis in 1988. Purple recreation refers to activities and interests indulged in by youths and adults during non-work, non-study, free time that does not fall within the parameters of what society views as wholesome or good. Purple recreation is not always starkly bad or evil, even though it does frequently approach that extreme. However, it is important to note that an activity may deviate from mainstream leisure, and while it may be viewed as odd or slightly taboo, it may not fall within the scope of purple recreation. To fall within the set range of purple recreation, an activity must be considered socially unacceptable by the majority of the population in which the activity is participated in. So it's very much up to the majority. It's a democracy with purple recreation. And the way that I like to kind of remember this, and I think a little bit of why Curtis named it purple recreation in the first place, is that just like a purple bruise, this kind of recreation might be damaging. As an example here, I've pulled a little bit of information. I have the citation at the bottom here from a really interesting master's thesis that was written back in 2009, titled Shades of Purple Recreation, from Courtney A. Wright, who completed her master's down at Missouri State University. In the study, Courtney had 231 individuals respond to the purple recreation scale that you can kind of see on the slide here, that goes from -10, which an individual rate a certain activity as being unacceptable, not cool, to +10, thumbs up for that activity is good, to assess its level of social acceptability, and compared individuals' rankings in 2009 with ratings from the original study conducted in the 1970s. So the results display various activities which were previously viewed as socially unacceptable in the 1970s. We find now that they've kind of shifted and changed towards a more positive societal view. I'm more focused here on what the actual findings were in 2009, which I'm going to show you here shortly, and then I'll tell you kind of how these have shifted and changed since the 1970s. So, of the many leisure activities that were asked to be rated by study participants, I picked out a few that I thought were particularly interesting, including we have video games and violent video games. Video games were seen as generally thumbs up, maybe not 2 thumbs up, but at least 1 at a 4.16. But violent video games scored below 0 at -0.55. Not super low, below 0, but again, kind of in that middle, in that gray zone. Next, I found extreme body modification versus body modification. So body modification was, say, piercing your ears or getting a little tattoo. Extreme body modification, I think, was kind of getting into like entire sleeves, maybe tattooing near the face was a very specific one. I think they even gave an example of like what a specific image of a tattoo could look like, but as soon as it got closer to an individual's face, it really kind of dropped down the scale. So body modification, we're at a 1.05, but as soon as we get into extreme body modification, individuals saw that as -3.11. Next, which is very interesting, we have social drinking coming in as, again, near that kind of 1 thumbs up zone at a 3.22 versus heavy alcohol use, which was heavily dinged at a -5.98. So again, very interesting how you have this huge discrepancy between 2 forms of alcohol use, but one being social drinking, the other being heavy alcohol use. And again, that's a really large difference between the two, almost 9 points. And then we have the use of marijuana. Again, this was in 2009, before a lot of legislation changed, which is kind of right in that gray zone, -0.24. A little bit above even 2 violent video games, versus heavy drug use. So heavy drug use being like very heavy, very serious drugs that are highly addictive. I believe the example that was given within the study that was given to participants was heroin use. So I believe, and I'll kind of I'll recheck it, I think on the future slide, heavy drug use at negative 8.26 was the most heavily criticized leisure activity. It was the one that was furthest down the scale compared to any others that were presented to participants. So again, huge discrepancy between the two. We also have compulsive gambling, which fell very, very low on the scale, negative 5.84. And then some of the more popular, viewed as good leisure activities, people thought they were morally sound, was fitness activities, extreme sports, and getting outside in nature, which was viewed as the most moral or good of leisure activities. Other original studies activities, such as pornography, marijuana, and off-color movies, remained on the negative side of the scale, but only slightly below zero. However, some other examples of leisure that were shown to participants, including kinky gadgetry, practical jokes, and pub crawls, ranked on the more positive side of the spectrum. Furthermore, social card playing, hunting, riflery, and social drinking, when compared to the scores that were given in the 1970s, all rated 2 points higher than they had been 50 years ago. In this study, the two most positively viewed activities from the 1970s, which were religious singing and volunteering, shifted significantly from how we were rating them in 2009. The activities of religious singing dropped 3 points, and volunteering also dropped very significantly in its positioning, and were no longer the highest ranked or most socially acceptable activity. The possible reason for this might be the decline in church attendance and a decrease in volunteering, but again, outside of the scope of this particular study. But it was outdoor recreation, fitness activities, participation in the arts, social games, and organized sports that are now seen as the highest ranked activities. So with this again, kind of as the umbrella for our discussion today of examples of taboo recreation, I'll be going into more detail about certain recreational activities, including dark tourism, vandalism, gambling, and risky health behaviors. Dark tourism is the act of travel to sites associated with death, suffering, or the seemingly macabre, and this is a definition put forth by Stone in 2006. Dark tourism is a phenomenon rooted in the circumstances of the late 20th century. The academic debate of dark tourism began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and during the early 1990s, several academics stressed the relationship between tourism and places of death. So we first started thinking about this idea in the 1990s. Foley and Lennon in 1996 introduced the term dark tourism in contemporary academic and media lexicon to denote the touristification of sites of death and disaster. Some examples of dark tourism spots include bus tours in New Orleans after Katrina. That's that photo that I have in the middle there. Visiting Egyptian mummies displayed in museums, as well as heavy tourism in Pompeii. A little bit about Pompeii, if you haven't heard of it before. Coming to see Pompeii is probably one of the longest standing dark tourism activities of all time, beginning about 250 years ago. And the thrill of seeing the dark bits of this archaeological site was always well camouflaged with other archaeological interest and in the cultural bits. So a little bit about the city of Pompeii. It was famous because it was destroyed in 79 BC when a nearby volcano, Mount Vesuvius, erupted, covering it in at least 6 meters of ash and other volcanic debris. The city's quick burial preserved it for centuries before its ruins were discovered in the late 16th century. People most often visit to see the remains of the inhabitants of Pompeii, and they come in droves. The site is visited by over 2.5 million tourists annually. And tourism pressure on Pompeii is so great that some parts have been closed off to visitors, and visitors have been redirected to see the other archaeological sites in the area to relieve Pompeii even just a little bit. a note on the idea and even the lexicon of dark tourism. Some scholars have sought to redefine dark tourism. Again, we're talking about taboo recreation. So if you're feeling, again, that little bit of that sticky, that icky feeling as I talk about going to see a mummy, of historical bus tours in New Orleans after a huge natural disaster, that is to be expected. And kind of with that idea of, again, kind of choosing kind of a fun kind of term here, dark tourism, some scholars have critiqued our use of this term, and others have suggested that we instead use terms like atrocity tourism, atrocity heritage, difficult heritage, trauma tourism, and death tourism instead. Again, a lot of academics feel like dark tourism doesn't quite fit the gravity of the tourist sites in which a lot of individuals flock to. But again, some food for thought, because I do want to offer evidence that kind of, again, maybe might make us question this idea of taboo, of this is always wrong at all times. So some evidence suggests that motivations for dark tourists, while at face value, might seem a little bit icky, a little bit sticky, but are they always negative? And according to research from Stone and Sharpley in 2008, consuming dark tourism might help individuals to, first, pay tribute to the victims. Second, reflect on the course of their lives. Next, address issues of personal meaningfulness, so essentially where our place in the world is, where our place in the universe is. Next, to feel more connected to their ancestors. And lastly, neutralize thoughts of death and dying. So again, while there might be individuals spending a lot of money on visiting places where atrocities have occurred, their motivations might not always be negative. There might be those little bits of, again, wanting to pay tribute. And again, those larger, I suppose, more positive outcomes, again, not for the atrocity that happened, but for that individual walking away. To, again, have a little bit more of a broader bird's eye view, perhaps a reshifting in their mind of the idea of death and dying. Next, the next example of taboo recreation is vandalism. Vandalism is a broad category of crime that is used to describe a variety of behaviors, and generally it includes any willful behavior aimed at destroying, altering, or defacing private or public property. This can include spray painting another person's house, egging someone's car house, keying someone's car, breaking windows, defacing public property with graffiti, defacing park benches. You'll see there on the picture on the slide that I have someone TPing a tree in front of someone else's house. This is very common and expensive to correct, and costs the United States about $15 billion a year. In Canada, vandalism involving property with a value below $5,000 can have an associated punishment of up to 2 years in jail, in addition to fines and/or probation. Punishment for vandalism for property over $5,000 can include a sentence of up to 10 years in prison. And for local news, local interest, in 2021, the city of Fort Saskatchewan, so just a little bit northeast of where we are here, not that you are on campus right now, but if you were to be on campus, paid $62,000 to remedy vandalism. But in 2022, the cost of vandalism repairs rose to a little over $230,000. Not exactly sure why, but just a little bit of local news for you folks to really kind of help sink in that this is an expensive form of taboo recreation to remedy. Next here we have gambling. Gambling is the wagering of money or something of material value on an event with an uncertain outcome. These stats here I have from the Problem Gambling Resources Network, Alberta. If you or someone that you know is concerned that they might have a gambling addiction, please do head to that. Just copy and paste those words right there and find their website, they do have a lot of really excellent resources that you can turn to. And I say that because over 80% of adult Albertans gamble on at least one gambling activity annually. And Albertans gamble over $23 billion legally annually. That was a number that honestly shocked me the first time that I saw it as I was putting together this presentation. And I believe the number that I saw is that while we put forth $23 billion annually, Albertans only get back about $2.5 billion annually. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there between those two numbers. Sport betting is becoming an increasingly popular form of gambling in Canada, and this is likely caused by the federal government legalizing gambling on individual sporting events back in 2021. I know if I'm watching any type of hockey game or any kind of sports game at all, the ads that are kind of coming through the channel are getting a little bit overwhelming for sport betting, and again, this is due to changes in recent legislation. This was not the case in terms of, again, all of the ads and all the revenue that all of these companies are receiving now, even just 2 years prior. And so again, to kind of confirm, or I guess reiterate what I was saying there about the resources that are present on the website on the previous slide, a gambling disorder is an addictive disorder characterized by dysregulated and recurrent gambling behaviors that can generate clinically significant levels of distress and impairments in functioning. So that is the clinical definition of a gambling disorder. And again, if you or someone that you love if you think you or someone that you love might be somewhere within that realm of that definition there, please do click to that previous slide to find that resource. What might drive people to gamble? There's a variety of reasons, and I've picked a couple here that were relevant to us in class. Firstly, one factor might be the thrill of uncertainty. And if you'll recall in Chapter 2, the play theorist Caldois identified alia, or plays of luck, or play regarding to luck and uncertainty. So again, that idea of luck, that of I don't know what's going to happen, and again, that feeling of like, ooh, loss of control, can be one reason for that sense of thrill, why folks seek to gamble. College students, in a paper put forth by Neighbors and their colleagues in 2007, stated that they like to gamble to firstly win money, to socialize, to feel excited, and to fill their time. And then that last point there, drawing on 15 years of field research in Las Vegas, anthropologist Natasha Dow Schull showed how the mechanical rhythm of electronic gambling pulls players into a trance-like state that she calls the machine zone, in which daily worries, social demands, and even bodily awareness fade away. I don't know about you, but this sure does sound a lot like the concept of flow that we talked about a couple chapters ago. Once individuals are in the zone, gambling addicts play not to win, but simply to keep playing for as long as possible, even at the cost of physical and economic exhaustion. In continuous machine play, gamblers seek to lose themselves, while the gambling industry seeks profit. Schull describes the strategic calculations between game algorithms and machine ergonomics, casino architecture, and ambiance management. If you've ever been to a casino, you'll notice that the lights are usually dim, a little bit dim, but like it still kind of feels like daylight. There's no clocks on the wall, and everything kind of melts into each other. The walls, the carpet pattern that's on the floor is very, very similar between the various parts of the casino. And this is all very much intentionally designed to make you lose the sense of time and to feel kind of dissatisfied, to want you to make you stay in this space for longer. Again, with Schull and their research, her account moves from casino floors into gamblers' everyday lives, from gambling industry conventions and Gamblers Anonymous meetings to regulatory debates over whether addiction to gambling machines stems from the consumer, the product, or the interplay between the two. So again, what might drive people to gamble? 3 kind of chunks here that I put forward to you all. First is the thrill of uncertainty. Next is to socialize and fill our time, win money and feel excited. And lastly, perhaps especially with those electronic kind of like slot machines, VLTs, we reach that sense of flow. And as we were talking about in class, flow can feel very, very good. But just because we can get into flow doesn't always mean that it's doing good for us. And I think this is a very plain example of a moment where flow isn't in our best interest. Again, showing you perhaps this topic of gambling in a light that you don't usually see it in. While there are several negative effects for the individual, gambling can have positive effects on communities, quality of life, and leisure. And this is very obviously shown with how the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission spends fundraising dollars. And they've claimed that they have helped raise over $28 billion for charitable organizations. And these include the Autism Society of Edmonton, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Canadian Cancer Society, the Canadian Mental Health Society, the Youth Emergency Shelter, amongst others. So while, again, for individuals, gambling can be quite harmful, there's a lot of provincial and federal legislation in place making Gaming and Liquor Commission, setting up the Alberta and other provincial gaming and liquor commissions to collect certain chunks of profit from the various gambling and liquor sales that do go on in each province. And it is mandated that these profits go towards charitable organizations who do reap the benefits from receiving those extra dollars and putting them forward so that they can benefit other communities and individuals' qualities of lives. And lastly here, my final example of risky health behavior, which is a little bit of a category where multiple different types of recreation and pastimes can be found, are risky health behaviors. And examples of this include smoking, drinking, using illicit drugs, and having unprotected sex. Some of the top risk behaviors that the CDC identified amongst teenagers were opioid use, bullying, tobacco and e-cigarette use, unprotected sex, like I mentioned, driving while texting, and physical inactivity. So these being kind of the top 6 top risk behaviors identified in 2018. I'll dive into a couple here in a little bit more detail. First is binge drinking. And this is a pattern of drinking that brings a person's blood alcohol concentration, or BAC, to over 0.08. And this is approximately 5 and over drinks for males and 4 and over drinks for females in one single sitting, usually around 2 hours. In Canada, approximately 33.5% of young men and 23.8% of young women binge drink at least once a month. Binge drinking is a well-established risk factor for death from any cause, including unintentional injuries, heart disease and high blood pressure, and inflammation of the gastrointestinal system, amongst others. So, again, really with the statement there being a well-established risk factor for death from any cause, it really solidifies to you how risky this health behavior can be. And then lastly here, before we move forward into some theories of why individuals engage in deviant behavior in the first place, is substance use disorder. This is a disease that affects a person's brain and behavior and leads to an inability to control the use of a legal or illegal drug or medication. This is a definition put forth by the Mayo Clinic in 2017. In 2012, 21.6% of Canadians met the criteria for substance use disorder, so a little over a fifth of Canadians. And 2 million people are in Alcoholics Anonymous across 170 countries, and I believe that is a very similar number for Narcotics Anonymous too. Please do head to, again, if you or someone that you love finds kind of fits within that definition of substance use disorder, I do have quite a few resources within our e-class that you can click around to. A lot of them are housed within the University of Alberta kind of organizational structure as well too. So again, please do reach out to those resources. Please do ask for help if you do worry that you're going down a path that you are not happy with. On to kind of the last piece of the puzzle for today, some explanations of deviance. The first that I have here, and that is explained in your textbook, but I'm going to go into it in a lot more detail that is given just on this single slide here, is anomie. So anomie has been conceptualized in different ways, but perhaps the most well-known approach is to define anomie as a state of society. Anomie is a state that occurs when existing societal norms are inadequate for providing directions for the life activities of its members, leading to deviant behaviors. This was a theory put forth by Durkheim in the late 1800s. Your textbook mentions that anomie might arise from boredom, and they do go more into detail about leisure boredom within the textbook, but this is not an opinion shared by very many scholars. The majority of researchers believe that anomie stems from the discrepancy between the cultural aspirations of people within a society and the legitimate means available to those people to achieve them. This might be caused by cultural obsession with economic success, manifesting itself as a set of cultural values associated with individualism, achievement orientation, and even to the fetishism of money. So we're all expected, or at least when we're growing up, to be a rock star one day, to be a prince or princess one day, to own a mansion on a hill, and have, infinite numbers that are in our bank account statements. So, but the reality is, even though we have these idealized notions or norms too in our minds, we are not given the ropes, we are not given the means to which we are able to achieve them. For instance, more specifically, attaining wealth is a major goal of many North Americans, but not all North Americans possess the means to do this, especially members of minority or disadvantaged groups. Those who find the road to riches close to them experience anomie, because an obstacle has thwarted their pursuit of a socially approved goal. When this happens, these individuals may employ deviant behaviors to attain their goals, retaliate against society, or merely make a point. So again, anomie is this state where this kind of, again, icky, sticky state where I have these goals, I have these big aspirations, but society is letting me down. Again, like I mentioned at the very beginning there, this is conceptualized as a state of society. So society as a whole isn't allowing me to get there. And so in order to still try and move forward towards that goal, I engage in deviant behavior. Next is strain theory. This is an extension of the anomie theory. So you'll find a lot of similarities too from anomie, but with some extensions from its major theorist, Merton. This argues that society puts pressure on individuals to achieve socially accepted goals, like the American dream, as I was mentioning, even though they might lack the means to do so. So again, very similar, but instead of calling it anomie, they call it strain. This leads to strain and may lead individuals to engage in deviant behavior. The difference and the extension here with strain theory being kind of that main core, up to this point, being very similar to what was stated with anomie theory, is that Merton came up with 5 different ways in which folks reckon with strain. So, but first, before I go into those 5, he posits, or he theorizes, that strain can be experienced at both the structural, or societal, as well as the individual level. And what I mean by this, structural level, this refers to the processes at the societal level which filter down and affect how the individual perceives his or her needs. For example, if a particular social structure is inherently inadequate, or there is inadequate regulation, this may change the individual's perceptions as to means and opportunities. So, how we perceive the structure of society is around us, and whether or not we feel like it is meeting or not meeting our needs. And then strain can also be experienced at the individual level. This refers to frictions and pains experienced by the individual as they look for ways to satisfy their needs. So if the goals of a society become significant to an individual, actually achieving them may become more important than the means adopted. I'll be more specific with that very, very vague definition there. Take, for example, the doping scandal that hit the world of competitive biking in 2012. After winning the Tour de France 7 years in a row, Lance Armstrong was found to have been taking performance-enhancing drugs. And now, at this point, there have been many, many documentaries done on this, and not only did he admit to taking to these drugs, but a really kind of key part of this story was that he said that this was simply part of how things were done in the cycling world, and that they were just as common as water bottles and tire pumps. This scandal illustrates how cultural goals, like winning, exist in tension with institutional rules. When a competitor begins to perceive the rules as an impediment to achieving their individual goal, widespread strain can set in, which leads them to circumvent these regulations in their attempt to win. So as I mentioned previously, Merton lays out 5 adaptations or modes of adjustment that people use to relate culturally defined goals with legitimate means. These adaptations include conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, which is talked in more detail in your textbook, and rebellion. To explain these in a little bit more detail, firstly, conformity is the most common response to cultural goals and institutional means. Individuals who conform accept and value cultural goals as well as the means that are approved by society to gain them or to reach them. They pursue cultural goals through socially approved means and tend not to very rarely experience strain. The next is innovation. These are individuals who accept and value society's goals, so say, again, the American dream, but create their own unapproved means for achieving them, usually because they do not have access to the institutional means. So, for example, engaging in organized crime, stealing, or selling drugs to achieve financial security. The next is ritualism. This is when individuals adopt the accepted means so severely that it becomes ritualistic, meaning that they no longer value the cultural goal, say wealth, yet they still blindly conform to the means as an end in and of themselves. So they may not care anymore. I don't care how much money is in my bank account. I don't care how much money I'm putting into my RRSP, but they're still kind of like almost like a zombie, going to work, still engaging in the means to which to achieve that goal, but they're completely disillusioned from that goal in the first place. And then lastly, explained more in detail in your textbook, is retreatism. People who have previously accepted cultural goals and the institutional means, who eventually abandon both the goals and the means. Retreatists still feel a moral obligation to use the institutional means, but their acceptance of the cultural goal pressures them to pursue the goal illegitimately. These conflicting values lead the individual to reject both the goal and the means, and instead find a way to escape the requirements of society. So not only do I not want to chase that American dream, become a millionaire, but I also refuse the way that is the normal way accepted by society, say like having a 9-to-5 job, in order to pursue that goal. They retreat from society as a whole. Some examples, more specific examples, might be social isolation or substance abuse. And then lastly, which is kind of outside of that 4-quadrant as a whole, which is interesting, is rebellion. This is usually due to frustration, oppression, or marginalization. And these are individuals who reject the cultural goals and the accepted means to achieve the goals. But different from retreating, instead, they attempt to introduce new cultural goals and new institutionalized means, ultimately aimed at producing a new social order. Examples of these might be various social movements, and any social change aimed at creating a society with more modest and equally accessible goals, as well as equal opportunity means. So again, separate from that quadrant there, with retreatism being rejecting both goals stated by society as being good, as well as the means to reach those goals. But instead of stepping away, rebellion steps in and tries to find a new route forward. This graph here, I'm trying my very best to simplify what are quite complex sociology concepts, and I do want to give one further example. And I'll further explain an example that's given in your textbook on page 188, where the authors talk about deviant behavior in the form of cheating on a final exam. College students are expected to get good grades, graduate, and enter a well-paying career. This could be the cultural goal. And they are supposed to do this by studying hard and learning lots. These are institutionalized means. What happens, however, when they're unable to accomplish this goal via the unexpected means? There are 5 options here. So one is that they could ignore the strain, so ignore that while they are working really, really hard, they are not quite meeting that goal of a high grade. Just ignore that as a whole and keep on going to class and studying, which would fall into the realm of conformity. Another option is that they could redefine the goals and means and make a change in their life, so ritualism. Or they could violate the means while hanging on to the goal and cheat at tests and plagiarize papers. This would fall into the innovation quadrant. They could also give up and stay in their dorm room playing video games and partying. This would be retreatism. So all 4 of these were within your textbook. And then in addition to this idea of rebellion, this is my idea and is like very big, is a lot. But it could be just leaving school as a whole and going off to create their own university where there are no test requirements. So again, retreating from that institutionalized mean and that cultural goal, but trying to find a new way, a new path forward. My third of 4 theories explaining deviance is labeling theory. Labeling theory concerns the meanings people derive from one another's labels, symbols, actions, and reactions. This theory holds that behaviors are deviant only when society labels them as such. Because of this, conforming members of society who interpret certain behaviors as deviant and then attach this label to individuals determine the distinction between deviance and non-deviance. Labeling theory posits that self-identity and the behavior of individuals might be determined or influenced by the terms used to describe or classify them by others. It is associated with concepts of self-fulfilling prophecy and sometimes too stereotyping. And social research indicates that those who have negative labels usually have lower self-images, are more likely to reject themselves, and may even act more deviantly as a result of the label put on them by society. If you remember back to a concept shared with you in chapter 4, this is a type of symbolic interaction, meaning that people attach meaning to symbols that are kind of arbitrarily assigned to us, and then act according to their subjective interpretation of these symbols, whether or not they are objectively true. Powerful individuals within society, such as politicians, judges, police officers, medical doctors, and so forth, typically impose the most significant labels. Proponents of labeling theory support the theory's emphasis on the role that the attitudes and reactions of others, not the deviant acts themselves per se, have on the development of deviance. So again, labeling theory. It's not the acts that we commit that are deviant. It's that we are labeled as such, and that kind of spurs on further deviant behaviors. And my last theory here that I'll be sharing with you is differential association theory. This is a theory developed by Edwin Sutherland, proposing that through interaction with others, individuals learn the values, attitudes, techniques, and motives for various deviant behavior. These others might include social groups such as peers on sports teams, let's say, housemates at college, cliques at school, and friends in the neighborhood. And this theory, the main takeaway from it, is that this suggests that deviant behavior is learned like any other type of behavior that we acquire as we move through our lives. An important quality of differential association theory concerns the frequency and intensity of the interaction that you have with others. The amount of time that a person is exposed to a particular definition and at what point the interactions begin are both crucial for explaining the resulting deviant behavior. The process of learning deviant behavior is really not any different from the process learned in learning any other behavior, like I mentioned. And Sutherland maintains that there are no unique learning processes associated with acquiring non-normative or deviant ways of behaving. That, again, is just like learning anything else. And I'll leave you with one final example here of this theory of differential association. This is from research from Sadolska and their colleagues in 2019. And these are quotes that are pulled directly from the article here, and again gives a really good example, I think, of this theory within a leisure context. So Sadolska found that leisure behavior amongst gang members revolved around house parties that usually involved drugs, alcohol, and sex, hanging around together on street corners, violence perpetrated against members of opposing gangs, and vandalism. And I think this quote here really speaks to the larger theory that we're talking about here with differential association theory. So in italics there, hanging around in the neighborhood, crashing our cars into their cars, stuff like that. I was raised in it. That's all I knew. When I was younger, it was fun to steal cars and to go to other neighborhoods to other gangbangers and crash them up. So again, that key there, I was raised in it. That's all I knew. Really hammering home this big takeaway of differential association theory, that deviant behavior is learned, just like anything else. So folks, I'm hoping by now we can all step away from this video with these 3 major takeaways. At the very beginning, we spoke about the definitions of taboo. So again, those being the rules decided by a society, and then deviance being the behaviors that we do that break those rules, as well as explain how those concepts arise in leisure spaces. Next, identify examples of taboo recreation and evaluate the positive and negative effects that result from these pastimes. So we talked about in the past 70 minutes here about gambling and problem gambling more specifically, and how it can be quite harmful for the individual. There are dollars that are given to charity organizations as a result. And lastly, I hope you're able to describe the 4 popular theories of deviance using some real-world examples. So with that idea of anomie and the idea of strain theory, I gave that example of Lance Armstrong, as well as cheating on a test, respectively, or how a student would cope with not reaching the grades that they had wanted. So I hope that you're able to have a greater understanding of those 4 theories, and more specifically are able to give some real-world examples for each of them.